And before I get into talking about universal salvation, just to give me a sense of where you as a class are coming from, could I get 2 or 3 questions or comments that you have, just a sentence or 2, about the topic of universal salvation? I just want to take a minute or 2 here. So could I get a volunteer? You just unmute yourself and shout it out. I see Lauren.
I'll be happy to start. Yeah, I find that I have always found the emphasis on having to prove yourself worthy of eternity in an imperfect, unequal, unfair world, very difficult to stomach. And the problem that I have in asserting that, Jim, is that the Bible, and particularly my denomination, has made a great deal of the topic of judgment. And judgment is sort of the sorting time, the winnowing time, to winnow out those who have qualified. And I have a very hard time with this notion of how you qualify for salvation in a world where a lot of people don't have the same information or understanding that we do. That's all I'm going to say, and then Deb and Eric can take over.
All I wanted to say is that although I don't particularly believe in universal salvation, I think some people will choose not to be, I do believe it's an opt-out issue, not an opt-in issue, if you know what I mean. You have to be very determined to convince God, no, don't want to live in a world that's run by love. And I think that's a much smaller number than we think. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. Is there one other person? Look, Chris looks like, and Dan Jett. Can we have those 2, Lauren, and then we'll go on.
Good morning, everybody. Just sitting down to breakfast here on the West Coast. For me, I've often wondered, and it sounds like heresy, but I wonder what the good God's plan has been to redeem Lucifer. And it's not revealed in Scripture. And it sounds like heresy whenever I bring it up to people, that God might have a plan for that too. And I'll just leave it at that it's something I wonder about, and I can't wait to get to glory to see for sure about my good and loving God and what his plans are for setting the universe straight.
And Dan Jett will be the last person.
I just wanted to raise my favorite Bible verse in John is about, in my Father's house are many mansions. It seems to me, I take that to mean that there's a place for almost everyone. Am I wrong in thinking that?
This is the book that we're going to be talking about, that all shall be saved, heaven, hell, and universal salvation. David Bentley Hart, Yale University Press, 2020. That's what we're going to be talking about.
On that, I think a topic that bears repeating that we've been talking about here at the seminar were the situation where an Adventist comes to the end of their life and grapples with whether or not they have salvation and really struggling to find out if salvation is an option to them. It's interesting to me because I think the Adventist religion is a very rigorous religion that has a lot of personal sacrifice and commitment. And for people who've lived that way their whole lives to come to the end and just struggle with whether or not salvation is something that will be accessible to them. We had a social worker who had worked in hospice that told us that this was something that was endemic to Adventist people. And Lauren had shared a story about his father. So I think this is kind of putting an Adventist twist on, is salvation available to all? Is salvation available to all Adventists? It's something that is on all of our minds, Jim, while you're working with that.
Yeah, and this was a particularly personal and heartbreaking thing to me, because I was with my father as he died, and after a lifetime of being a Seventh-day Adventist, he had no sense of security of salvation. And it was not this particular story was very personal to me, but it was not unusual in my experience as a pastor either. Okay, Jim, you've got it up, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So those of you who've read what Lauren has shared with you will see that I've tried to organize this in a way that makes it more accessible and gets to some of the ideas that are of particular importance. First of all, David Bentley Hart. He is a Eastern Orthodox theologian, got his doctorate at University of Virginia, Charlottesville. He, as an undergraduate, studied world religions. He was a high Episcopalian before becoming Eastern Orthodox. He is particularly enamored with the early church fathers. He first came to my attention, at least I first met him in San Diego about 3 years ago, when some of my younger colleagues here at Loma Linda and La Sierra, who head up the Society of Adventist Philosophers, invited him to give our keynote address. And he gave a stimulating address at that time. And he is part of a larger movement called radical orthodoxy. And I'll be saying a bit more about that in a moment. But why study him here at this Sabbath school class? You know, why are these young Adventist theologians becoming interested in him? I think it's because there are some theologians in the Christian church generally, and some younger theologians, particularly in the Adventist church, who are not satisfied with the answers that even progressive theologians like Paul Tillich, or some would say Reinhold Niebuhr, have given to questions of belief. Also, some are questioning the near stranglehold that secular thought has on the imagination of almost everybody in the developed world. And David Bentley Hart is a brilliant thinker who is offering a different paradigm. So that's a reason that I chose to read him, and in a sort of a parallel class, we're going through his book chapter by chapter on that all shall be saved. Today, I want to particularly focus on three aspects of his thought. You can see his adamant opposition to eternal hellfire, his basic case for saving everyone, God saving everyone, and then just a brief exposure to his undergirding philosophy of Christianity that leads him to freely dismiss the idea as silly, and tragic, that there would be an eternal torment, and also that all people would not be saved. You know, what's the basis for that sort of radical thinking? Or at least it appears to many of us as being radical. Well, first of all, let's talk about eternal torment. One of three reviewers that I found of David Hart's book is this Daniel Wadlow, and he says, from my own Catholic infernalist, and that's a term that David Bentley Hart uses in a derisive way throughout his book, infernalist. From my own Catholic infernalist perspective, is what he's writing from. In this interpretive summary of the author says that Hart's, and of course this is a quote from Wadlow, Hart's thesis is not merely that all particular souls will happen to be saved, but additionally that a state of eternal damnation is not even a theoretical possibility. He strives to support this thesis primarily through his logical analysis of the doctrine of hell and secondarily through biblical exegesis. He argues that the idea of hell is logically impossible, morally abhorrent, and absent from Christian revelation. Even if we might agree that it's logically impossible and morally abhorrent, we might question his assertion that it's absent from Christian revelation, if we accept the book of Revelation as being part of that. Hart argues for an admittedly minority position on hellfire in this book, but so do we Adventists. Both Hart and Adventism take a position opposite that of the Revelator regarding the wicked at the last judgment, who will be, and here I quote from Romans 14, tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image. As a believer, indeed as a philosophically and scientifically informed theologian, Hart accepts revealed truths from the Bible, but his interpretation of such notions as hell and heaven must make sense in today's world. And I emphasize that. It must make sense. A recurring theme in his book is how what we believe as persons needs to make sense to us. Maybe it's because of my being a traditional Adventist that I'm drawn to that. Traditional in that our pioneers had to have truths that made sense to them, present sense, present truth to them. And so I appreciate that about what Hart is doing here. So is it really a surprise that Hart confesses what his idea of eternal hell really means? He says, for what it's worth, I do in fact believe in hell, though only in the sense of a profound and imprisoning misery that we impose upon ourselves by rejecting the love that alone can set us free. Practically all of us go through life as prisoners of our own egos. Hence, a secret that we all too often hide from ourselves is that we walk in hell every day. There is, though, another and greater secret too. We also walk in heaven, also every day. This too we can occasionally see, though usually only in rare moments of spiritual wakefulness or imaginative transport. And then he continues, redemption then, if there is such a thing, must consist ultimately in a conversation of the heart so complete that one comes to see heaven for what it is, and thus also comes to see precisely where one formerly had perceived only the fires of hell, now the transforming glory of infinite love. And love never fails, a reference to Paul's 1 Corinthians 13 chapter. So that's all I wanted to say about eternal hell, although much of the book is on that. But correlated with that, very closely united to his rejection of eternal hellfire, which is a position held by the Roman Catholic Church, evangelical Protestantism, more liberal Protestantism doesn't go there, but the vast majority of Christians are there. and Hart is taking them on with full force. But along with that is his notion of universal salvation. And us Adventists, we would applaud him on what he does with that passage in Revelation 14, as clear as it is, as biblical as it is. Ellen White and David Hart are there together rejecting the Bible on eternal hell. And we might want to come back to that, but I think that that is noteworthy in itself. And one question that arises from that, if we can take on eternal hellfire in the way we do by rejecting it, can we also reject passages that suggest a judgment that divides the good from the bad, the righteous from the unrighteous, the saved from the wicked, and join Hart in saying, hey, because of God's goodness, we're all going to end up in the place of eternal bliss. That's going to be the question, I think, before us. Let's now turn to this universal salvation theme. Hart's position is clear. If all are not saved, then God is a monster. And the reality we live is something considerably worse than a nightmare, according to Hart. He uses, I think it's 24 Bible texts from the New Testament. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 of them here, starting with Romans 5, 18 and 19. And before we even go to that, let me go to the paragraph following F, because this sort of sets the context. I say, of course, the book of Revelation makes a contrast between the saved and the damned. That's starkly clear. But I say, is it relevant that Revelation, the book of Revelation, was only, as Elaine Pagels, the Princeton scholar, says, it was only squeezed into the canon in the 4th century, some 200 years or more after it was written. And it was an apocalyptic book. It's in that genre. It's the 27th book in the canon. As we say, it barely made it into it. Notable Christians like Martin Luther saw it as questionable. So I say, what role does tradition, early church tradition, the tradition of the church generally, what role does tradition play in our doctrine, even on such an important theme as the salvation of whom? It's pretty well established now, but I would suggest, and Hart surely implies this, that it wasn't that established early on. And I think that he makes his case quite strong on that. Also, what does an evident plurality of biblical viewpoints on a topic mean for the church and for its interpretation? What does that mean for individual church members and our interpretation? And now I want to go and show the plurality that exists in the New Testament. And if you can, and this is almost impossible for us, can we set aside our lens of 2,000 years of believing that it's just self-evident that at the end there are going to be the good people and the bad people? The good people go to heaven and the bad people go to hell for whatever duration. Can we put that aside for a moment and let particularly Paul, some passages in his writing stand on their own? So let me start with Paul, Paul's epistle to the Romans. This is 1a here on the left. Romans 5:18 and 19. And I just last night went back and read the context of this, and I would encourage you to do that. Look at the whole chapter 5 in Romans. 18 and 19 are not so much taken out of they're not taken out of context at all. They are just a summation of a whole line of reasoning that Paul has in Romans 5. Here is that summation. Then, as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one man's act of righteousness leads to acquittal and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. Well, you might say, well, there is that one word, many will be made righteous. Paul could have said all will be righteous. Well, yeah, maybe that's why he didn't use the word all, because it's not going to be all, it'll just be many. Sort of picking up on, who was it? Debonair was saying, it's going to be an opt-out issue. There will be many, almost all will be saved. Okay, well, but look at 1 Corinthians 15:22. For again, that analogy of sin through one, salvation through one. And here it does talk about all. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. 1 Corinthians 15. Colossians 1. For in him, in Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Now let me go to D. This is a passage which is equally clear. It's not one that Hart talks about, but he could have, because this has to do with the salvation of Israel. And I think this shows, particularly as it's correlated with the other passages I've just given you and others that we could read, an expansiveness in Paul's view of God and God's grace. And particularly given the fact that he was a Jew, that God particularly used the Jewish people, Judaism, for hundreds of years. Paul makes this point. Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you, Romans, to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles come in, whatever that means. But then get this, and so all Israel will be saved. Period. What do we make of that? Now, A, B, and C are three of over 20 biblical passages that indicate universal salvation that Hart points to. And so let's go on to point 2 on the right side of your screen. Many contemporary theologians cite human wrong choice. We chose badly for the reason why God is justified in torturing the wicked and denying salvation. And as Lauren earlier pointed out, we Adventists particularly make a huge deal of judgment. We really put the individual in the hot seat, literally, forcing that individual to decide for God or against God. And if we choose against God, we are going to go to the fires of hell, as Ellen White says, for varying periods of time and differing temperatures of heat. That's essentially what she says. Surely no eternal torment. But according to Hart, it's the argument that we've just referred to of rational freedom, the argument of rational freedom of the creature that is the justification for what God does. This is what's given in the tradition. It's rational freedom from the creature and from the refusal of God's trespass upon that freedom for fear of preventing the creature from achieving a true union of love with the divine. Let me go to the next paragraph. Perhaps Hart's most severe criticism of hellfire being the just desert for anyone is that none of us has, and this is an important quote from him, none of us has absolutely unpremised liberty, obeying no rationale except its own spontaneous volition toward whatever end it might pose for itself. And here he seems to be echoing much of what we read in neuroscience today about the brain and how it operates in a social context. But he is just very insightful in what he's saying here. Further, Hart contends that the character of even the very worst among us is in part the product of external contingencies. And somewhere in the history of every soul, there are moments when a better way was missed by mischance, or by malign interventions from without, or by disorders of the mind within, rather than by any intentional perversity on the soul's own part. And we might say the soul on its own part, isolated from all of these factors, genetic and social and historical, that make us who we are. Let me continue. Hart cites two examples in developing this idea of limited freedom. The first is Hitler, the second would be Adam and Eve. Hitler becomes the Führer for one of two reasons, according to Hart, or it may be a combination. He had bad influences in his upbringing, or he was congenitally wicked. Regardless, according to Hart, his guilt was a qualified one, and he was never wholly free. Similarly, Adam and Eve were not intrinsically evil, but were merely somewhat naive and ignorant. When, therefore, we try to account for the human rejection of God, we can never trace the wanderings of the will back to some primordial moment of perfect liberty, some epistemically pristine instant when a perverse impulse spontaneously arose within an isolated, wholly sane individual will, or within a mind perfectly cognizant of the whole truth of things. Again, drawing on his notion of how there is not this pure atomistic neutral soul that decides without any external conditioning or any internal predispositions, which one didn't choose, on its own. You know, he questions that sort of image that I think many of us have about ourselves being these free persons that the Adventist tradition presupposes. Okay, let's go from that to the undergirding philosophy that Hart has, which allows him to make these bold moves as a theologian regarding heaven, hell, universal salvation. I've mentioned radical orthodoxy. And here we'll say just a bit more about it. Hart is particularly brilliant in so clearly laying out how naturalism also goes by the name of physicalism and materialism, how naturalism inevitably goes beyond its own announced realm, the realm of the natural, the realm of the material. And this is going to get a little bit subtle, so if you can follow me here, because this is quite important. So I'm saying that he's laying out how materialism makes metaphysical or philosophical claims about that realm that he says are not compatible with the very idea of materialism. Now, why is that? Hart observes that the doctrine that there is nothing apart from the physical order is an incorrigibly incoherent concept, and one that is ultimately indistinguishable from pure magical thinking. The very notion of nature as a closed system entirely sufficient to itself is plainly one that cannot be verified, deductively or empirically, from within the system of nature. It is a metaphysical conclusion regarding the whole of reality. So are you following him there? If you take just this material stuff, just these inert, live atoms that compose a rock or a tree or anything that's natural, how can that natural stuff make judgments about itself, and saying that that's all that there is are these atoms of trees and rocks? He's saying you have to get outside of that to make such a judgment. But by getting outside of that, you are defying the very idea of things being basically reducible to their atomic structures, and that's all that there is. Okay, let me continue. David Bentley Hart is not a card-carrying, radically orthodox thinker, but he holds more in common than separates him from this Cambridge-inspired movement. I've talked about Hart, but John Milbank is the leader at Cambridge of a group of theologians who are pushing radical orthodoxy. And they both deeply lament that secularism is the default ideological construct of today's thought world. And this has been so for at least the last couple of centuries. Hart himself could have written Milbank's criticism of secularism's materialist ideology, which Milbank sees as soulless, aggressive, nonchalant, and nihilistic. Making no sense beyond itself, not conforming to traditional values. Hart's book shows just how central is his charge against nihilism. Nihilism being the notion of that traditional values are unfounded and that existence is senseless and useless. Milbank too joins Hart in decrying the lack of any metaphysical foundation in secular materialism's account of existence. Regarding existence, Milbank says that, and I think this is particularly good, all there is only is because it is more than it is. I was earlier trying to explain that. In a bizarre way, it seems that modernity does not really want what it thinks it wants, says Milbank. But on the other hand, in order to have what it thinks it wants, it would have to recover the theological. Radical orthodoxy and Hart offer a bold alternative to the supposedly nihilistic modernism that so dominates our age. They offer explicitly pre-modern religion, specifically patristic Christianity. Hart admits that his thinking owes more to Platonic than Aristotelian influences. Rather than the default presupposition of secularism, the default position is religion. Hart literally flips the prevailing approach to examination of reality, the presupposition that dominates our culture, including, I would suggest, yours and mine. I'm convinced by Hart's and radical orthodoxy's contention. What do you think? I'll be interested to see what your thoughts are. On what basis does Hart so radically reconceptualize heaven and hell and salvation? I suggest that the answer lies in Hart's thorough integration of what are too often seen as opposites: faith and reason, revelation and nature, supernatural and natural, the divine and the human. He's able to do this because he, rather than follow Aristotle, has a Platonic vision of God and goodness that he boldly puts forward for our consideration. He contends for the inseparability of God and goodness. So it is no error of reason for a believer to refuse to assent to a supposedly complete narrative of God and creation if that narrative severs every analogical connection between goodness among creatures and the goodness of God. In fact, reason and faith alike forbid such an assent. To believe solely because one thinks faith demands it, in spite of all the counsels of reason, is actually a form of disbelief, of unfaithfulness. Submission to a morally unintelligible narrative of God's dealings with his creatures would be a kind of epistemic nihilism, reducing the act of fidelity to God to a brutishly obstinate infidelity to reason, whose substance, again, is God himself. And then I say, wow, what a clear confession of Hart of his own commingling of reason and faith, of goodness and God. Next paragraph. Hart gives a glaring example of how God and goodness have been tortuously separated. The reformer John Calvin, in his formulation of double predestination. The Calvinist account of predestination is unquestionably the most terrifying and severe expression of the late Augustinian heritage. Calvin makes no effort to deceive either us or himself that there is some deeper kindness in the doctrine he proclaims, hidden from our own sinful eyes only by our own depravity. He proclaims that God hates the damned, and in fact created them to be the objects of his hatred. For him, the true unadorned essence of the whole story is nothing more than sheer absolute power exercising itself for God's sake. So all of this comes from this Platonic vision of God and goodness. And Hart cannot conceive of such a God of goodness creating a world which wouldn't finally come out positive and good. He can't conceive of a God even gambling on the possibility that things might work out well. He believes that God has designed the world in such a way that finally all will be saved. And so just for your consideration, I have here 2 or 3 questions that you may want to pursue, but you probably have your own. Let me just read 4 and 5 because I've commented on these. Most of us have atomistic notions of our free will. Hart's idea is that of a rational freedom, that if we are truly rational and free, we would choose appropriately. And he gives an illustration of a person like you or me standing next to a burning house, and we don't have a kid in there, and there's nobody in the house, but because we're free individuals, we're free to run into that house. And he says, who in their right mind, in their rational mind, would run into such a house? It doesn't make sense. Well, he doesn't think that it makes sense to choose to do wrong unless we are prompted by irrational influences that are beyond us, outside of us. Therefore, he credits God's creation in his own image, us creatures, of being these sort of individuals who do choose good, choose rational good when we're in our right minds. And therefore, because none of us who choose evil are in our right minds, God understands that, and God is going to save all of his creatures. Point number 5, and I'll close on this. Take the very idea, this is a different train of thought, but it's one that I've had lurking in my mind for at least a couple of decades, even before I read Hart, and that is the idea of righteousness by faith. We say we're not saved by works, but we're saved by faith. And sometimes we talk about faith being a gift of God. Now, if that's so, why does God gift some of us and not others? And if we individually have anything to do with our exercising of faith, how is that not in itself a type of work? So finally, is faith a quasi work if it's not given as a gift by God to all? How does this issue influence, I question, the idea of universal salvation? So, Lauren, Gina, that's all I wanted to put on the table for discussion. Where do we go from here?
Thank you, Jim, for your presentation.